Joining me now to discuss Chris Whitty's revelation yesterday about lockdowns being political rather than scientific decisions is Jamie Jenkins, independent statistician and former head of health analysis at the ONS, and Dr David Lloyd, a GP with the NHS. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you both very much for joining me. Jamie, what did you make of Whitty's admission yesterday, if I can come to you first?
Yeah, I suppose, Bev, it's kind of interesting in terms of where we are. So Module 1 is looking at the preparedness for the pandemic, so how prepared we were going into it. Module 2 of the COVID inquiry will look at more around the lockdowns, and I think that was kind of discussed yesterday. But what Chris Whitty is kind of saying there, which was kind of interesting for me, is that the clip that you said is that, it was a big idea. Now, this new idea was these lockdowns, which was mandatory quarantine for the population. And he said it would be surprising that unless it was requested by a senior politician, that the scientific committee would actually go into that kind of suggestion overall. So to me, is that a bit of distancing himself from the kind of the lockdown measures themselves? But I think what we need to consider there then, if any of these meetings were taking place, surely there were minutes of these meetings. So the COVID inquiry, probably in Module 2, when they consider what was actually happening during the pandemic, not before the pandemic, that could come to light. But ultimately, he said it was an extraordinarily major social intervention, his words, with huge economic and social ramifications. And we're seeing the huge social and economic ramifications now, Bev. So I think for me, he's kind of admitting that lockdowns were probably a quite extreme measure that the scientific community wouldn't have gone with without politicians' advice.
Yeah. Dr David Lloyd, as a doctor, do you find that shocking to think that these decisions to lock up healthy people were political rather than scientific based?
Yes, I must admit it was a bit of a shock to read that myself, because I thought that this was all based in science. I think they made the right decision, though, because if you look at the rate at which countries locked down, the countries that locked down the quickest have come out of COVID the best and also have the lowest mortality rates. So if it was a politician or a scientist, I don't really mind, except that we were too late to go into lockdown.
So you think we were too late to go into lockdown, but would you supported the subsequent lockdowns, David? Do you think they went on too long?
Well, I think those are very good questions, and I don't know whether we can do the answer or not. We were saved by the vaccine. The vaccine absolutely did change the whole thing about COVID, so that if we had very effective vaccines very quickly, which were absolutely extraordinary in how good they were. And so that did change the subsequent waves. And so I think that's where the inquiry should be looking at, is whether the lockdowns went on too long. But there is absolutely no doubt in my mind is that whether a politician or a scientist made the decision, we were weeks late locking down the first time and therefore lost thousands of lives.
Jamie, people will say, why does this matter now, Bev? Why are you talking about this in summer 2023? But I think it really matters because so many of the situations that we find ourselves in now, particularly with the economy, really matter. And we're just at the start of the COVID inquiry. What do you make of David's assessment that actually the lockdown saved lives? And if you look globally across the world, that's evidential.
Well, I think the first thing is the very first wave that we had, Bev, nobody knew what was going on. So there's a lot of discussion. Did we lock down too late? Did we lock down, should have been a bit earlier? Or did we continue the lockdown too much? I think one of the things we have seen from the data since the UK and other countries across the world have gone into the living with COVID phases, we continue to have these COVID waves. They're much, much lower than what they are because of the immunity across the population that's been built up. But what you tend to find is they go up for about 4, 5 or 6 weeks, the cases, and then they start coming back down again. And the question is, would that have happened during the first wave and the second wave without any interventions? The later evidence would suggest potentially, but obviously we don't know. The thing for me is that when we were kind of going into the kind of later on in the pandemic, there was always calls for more and more interventions. And I think at the back end of 2021, Boris Johnson said he wouldn't introduce new interventions when the SAGE modelers were saying that we could get significant deaths if we did. And then we were able to mark the homework there, Bev. And what we saw is that 93% was the deaths were lower than what they were suggesting. So the difficulty when you look in retrospectively back as to what was going to happen, the evidence was suggesting, the modelling was quite clear out. So I've sat in ministers' rooms myself for a time as a civil servant, when you're giving them advice and you're talking them through the data. So if some of the modelling that was coming out from Sage at the very start of the pandemic, no doubt some politicians were saying, well, how do we stop these doomsday scenarios? The big question the COVID inquiry needs to look at for Module 2 is, how good or bad was the modelling? Because politicians wouldn't have been suggesting lockdowns if the modelling, where they were suggesting all these kind of doomsday scenarios, weren't being presented to them. So that's the critical thing for me, Ben.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, the modelling, unfortunately, was, like you say, was so wildly off. The Imperial College figures, particularly at the beginning, were just, they said to be 500,000 dead within a matter of months, effectively, and it was nowhere near that. Do you see, David, now in your practice, the people that you're treating now, do you feel a sense of frustration that you had cancers that were missed or treatments that are now backed up and delayed, huge waiting lists, and question the damage that was done and whether it was really worth it?
Golly, the first part of your question is absolutely right. My life is now full of patients that are waiting huge lengths of time for operations, that they're presenting with cancers that are too late. And we have a health service that is falling apart because of the stress and the strain that we had during COVID, and then the underfunding and the extraordinary pressures that the NHS is under. So that part is right. But really, there's lots of data out there which does suggest that we were doing some of the right things. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the difference in mortality between Republican states in the USA and Democratic states, the Republican states who locked down late and didn't really take any notice of lockdown and had very low vaccination rates, they had a mortality rate that was 30% higher. And economically, they've come out of COVID much worse off than the Democratic states. I'm not sure that's strictly true, is it, Jamie? I might be wrong.
Yes, I see Florida as a very successful case in which there may have been a slightly higher mortality, perhaps, amongst 30%. The elderly from COVID. But when you look now, and that's what the COVID inquiry is about, you've got to look at the cost and benefits of what they're dealing with in this particular point. Has their economy grown? Are there young people suffering mental health? Are their hospitals all backed up like ours are? Can people pay their mortgages because the inflation's gone through the roof, because we were printing quantitative easing to allow people to stay at home? I think it's too simplistic to say, well, look at the mortality rate from COVID at that one window of time. Jamie?
Well, ultimately, you've got to look at the broader thing, which is all-cause mortality over a number of years. And one of the things that we do know from the data is that Sweden is a good example where they've got one of the lowest excess mortalities across the world. Now, they didn't introduce the same measures that many countries did. They did have a lot of what you would call voluntary kind of people deciding to restrict their movements and stuff. But ultimately, Sweden comes down, when you look at the excess death charts, as one of the lowest across the world, and they didn't have the kind of the measure that some countries across the world are. I haven't looked, there's so many countries in different states. I haven't looked at the specific questions that Dr. David's talking about there in the United States. But I think ultimately the reckoning in terms of what the COVID inquiry really needs to do is, if Chris Whitty's talking about the fact that this is kind of a major step with all the kind of the societal and economic harms, Module 2 is going to be very, very interesting. I'm sure you'll be covering this on your morning show quite regularly, Bev, on this, because ultimately we need to understand what we did wrong during the pandemic. Because if something happens again, we've got to get things much, much better. And for me, one of the things we haven't really got a reckoning in terms of, the big thing is the science was saying we're following the science, but ultimately, were we following the science, or was it a groupthink mentality that we just did what other countries did, so we didn't think that we were out of step, so we would be criticised for not doing certain measures?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it remains to be seen whether anybody feels satisfied by the COVID inquiry, but I think we've got about another 3 years to wait and at least 40 million quid of taxpayers' money before we get there. But gentlemen, we barely scratched the surface. Thank you both so much for joining me this evening. Let me know what you think at home. Do you have any faith that the COVID inquiry is actually going to do what it intends to do? I just feel like it's going to be a bit of a whitewash, actually. As I said, a backside covering exercise maybe for a lot of people who were involved.